about how they were following news about the Iran war. And here, if you look at audiences above 35 and those under 35, you can see almost a mirror image between those in the older demo preferring TV as their main source of news, and those who are aged 35 and under preferring these social media and video networks. Quite a stark contrast there. I think another thing that's quite interesting in this data is that more people under 35 in the States were not following the Iran war at all than were saying that they preferred to follow it on news websites and apps. And part of the reason is not just because people are migrating away from TV and news websites and apps, but some of the youngest people are not using them at all. So more than a third of Americans aged between 18 and 24 have never regularly watched TV news, nor have they ever regularly used websites and apps as a way of getting their news. I said I'd talk a bit more about chatbots. I think we would describe this as fast but not explosive growth, moving from 7 to 10 percentage points overall. You can see some markets where it's moving much more quickly and becoming more significant. But there are places like the US and also the UK where usage of chatbots for news in the UK is among the lowest of anywhere that we survey, and it's kind of like standing out as a bit of an outlier there. And perhaps part of the reason why this is growing quickly but not explosively is because it seems in this slightly messy chart here that audiences haven't really yet found one thing that they really love doing on AI chatbots for news compared to other ways of getting it. So you see some things starting to emerge in different countries, themes around depth and speed and so on and so forth. But I think unless and until audiences either figure out what AI chatbots are really good for news, or the platforms themselves come up with a killer application, that together with trust in news on AI chatbots, which continues to be relatively low, may be holding back the pace of growth. I said that changes were happening at different speeds in different countries. So if we look at reach of the major UK news brands that we ask about, you can see here that there's very little change year on year compared to 2025, but that's not the case everywhere. So if you look at the US data, you can see that both among those broadcast and print brands, and also among the online brands, some of the numbers are dropping quite fast for some of the biggest brands operating in the news space in the US. Let's talk about trust, because it is one of the big headlines for this year. And this chart here shows changes in trust from 2025 to 2026. And this is quite a remarkable shift just in a 12-month period, where you can see we have a statistically significant drop in trust in 29 of the 48 markets that we track. And over here on the left-hand side, like some really dramatic drops in a kind of like interesting selection of markets. And so trying to figure out what's going on there and what might be explaining such a big year-on-year change is a big challenge for us. There are also other indicators of a world and an audience that's feeling like nervous and anxious about things. So fake news concerns have gone up to 62% across the 48 markets this year. It actually stands at 77% in the UK. People say they're worried about what's fake and what's real online. News avoidance has nudged up a bit. It's at 42% of people globally now saying it. Again, in the UK, you see more unease and anxiety. 50% of people in the UK say that they are now avoiding the news sometimes or often. More marked among women. So women living in the UK aged between 45 and 54, 2/3 of them now report that they're avoiding the news sometimes or often. But to go back to the question of trust, I think one thing is interesting is to look at these 5 markets where we have the biggest year-on-year drop in trust over the year and compare that change in trust in news overall to what people are saying in terms of the trustworthiness of individual news brands. And here you can see that when we ask about 15 to 20 news brands in individual markets, the changes in trust don't seem to match up to the change in trust overall. And I think what that's pointing to is concerns about the news and information environment more widely, increasingly as people are consuming on these third-party platforms, than about the trust in these individual news brands that perhaps they've grown up with, that they're very familiar with, and so on. So brands are still trusted, even if the relationship with them is more distant and elongated through their intermediated consumption. There is something around this idea of the trust gap that we're introducing this year. And what this chart is showing is that in the orange bar, you have trust in news overall, and that is significantly higher than what people say in terms of their trust in news that they get either on social media or on AI chatbots. But this is just a static picture. And when you think about it dynamically, and as that consumption mix starts to shift, you're likely to see this trust in news overall starting to go down as consumption shifts towards platforms that people are trusting less. So it may well be that even though this is the lowest figure we've reported so far, that number goes down in future even further. Here is the trust ratings for the UK this year, largely unchanged again, perhaps bearing out this idea that people continue to trust major news brands, even if their trust in news overall is going down. That's not the case everywhere though, and I think the US is a good example in that regard. So you can see in America that trust in some of the major news brands, not only has it gone down as much as trust in the US overall, but it's gone down by more than that. In some very notable instances. They're a reflection, I think, of just how difficult the US news market is becoming for everyone. Let's focus on the growth of some of the individual networks, and really this is a story about the growth in video consumption. So these are global figures for usage of different platforms for news over the last 5 years, and this is really a story about the seemingly unstoppable rise of video networks, particularly in Instagram and TikTok, but also YouTube. And there are certain markets around the world where the numbers for the usage of YouTube and TikTok for news are much higher than you see here. So in places like India, Kenya, South Africa, and so on, you have close to 60% of our respondents are saying they're using these platforms for news consumption. One really striking, I think quite unsettling thing is despite the growth in consumption of online video and audiences' appetite for it, most of that, in fact all of it, seems to be going to third-party platforms. So here you can see consumption of any online video growing from 69% to 77% over the last 5 years. Here's how it's grown for third-party platforms, and here's how it's grown or not grown for publishers, right? So not only are publishers losing market share in terms of online video consumption, it's going down and down significantly in absolute terms. And I think trying to figure out why that's happening and what the solution might be is perhaps one of the biggest questions coming out of this year's data. But something that is interesting and worth bearing in mind is that the pivot to video isn't all about short form, and it's not all about mobile devices. For sure, for TikTok, for example, you can see that consumption is concentrated amongst shorter duration videos, but there's a much more plural split for YouTube for news. And something really interesting that we see is, and we write about this in the report, is that it's actually younger people are doing more of the longer form consumption at the far end of this chart. So it's not all about short form, and also the role of the television set seems to be taking on something of a new guise as well in the online video world. So a quarter of our respondents are now saying that they're using YouTube or third-party video apps to watch TV news on their devices. So broadcast TV news may be in structural decline, but the television set as a place for getting news continues to live on, both for younger and older audiences. It's essential, I think, that we talk about creators because they're one of the big themes that we've been researching and reporting on over the last 12 months or so. And they play a significant part in this growth of both video consumption and video networks. A quarter of respondents now are saying that they're using creators who mainly focus on news for at least some of their news diet each week. Again, there is significant country-by-country variation. Typically, it's countries over to the left where social media and third-party platforms are playing a bigger role, where creators are bigger. But you can see in some of these markets, Thailand, for example, almost half the audience are now getting news from news creators on a weekly basis. But we wanted to try to get a handle on how much impact, like how significant is this consumption in people's overall news diet. So we asked people, if you're using news creators, to what extent are those news creators meeting what we labelled as your news needs? And you can see the data here, which is that 13% of people globally are saying that news creators are meeting most or all of their news needs. Again, significant national variation in that. But I think what I take away from this is that creators seem to be playing a complementary rather than a substitutional role in people's news consumption. If you flip that 13% the other way around, 87% of people are saying that news creators are playing only some or no role in meeting their news needs. And if you look at the data country by country, what we see is that people who are using news creators are consuming more of traditional news brands than people on average. So creator usage seems to invite people to use the established brands that they've grown up with more than people who are not. If you narrow in and look only at the people who are exclusively or say that all of their news needs are being met by creators, we just have 3% of people globally saying that. And in markets down at the right-hand end of the chart, it's like fewer than 1% of the audience are saying they're relying exclusively on creators. So growing, playing a role, but it seems to be alongside people's existing news consumption. Nevertheless, I think the data is quite interesting when we ask people, how do you stack up creators against traditional news brands? And we ask them against these 8 different attributes. And you can see here among people who do and don't use news creators a clear kind of sense of perception of what creators in a relative sense are good at compared to established and traditional news media. But when you cut the data by people who are actually using creators, you get quite a different picture, that actually people who are using news creators report that they prefer news creators compared to traditional media on each of these 8 metrics that we ask about. Okay, let's take a look at maybe let's take a look. Okay, these are the most mentioned creators here in the UK. Some change on last year. This is, and bear in mind, we asked people to name up to 3 news-focused creators that they use. I think for many people in the room, these names will now be quite familiar. Mainly UK-based, some US-based ones as well. I think one other thing that's starting to emerge is that the better known and the most successful creators are rapidly turning from sole trader operators into small and in some cases medium and large businesses as well. And I think the dividing line, which historically has been quite distinct between creators and established media, is going to start to blur both in the minds of news publishers as people try to figure out how to capitalize on interest in creators, and also in the perception of audiences as well. I'm going to talk a little bit about news values. You've already heard something about impartiality. We returned a question this year from 2020 where we asked people what they thought about one aspect of impartiality, which is getting news from a particular point of view, or news that shares their point of view. You can see the data here back in 2020. And actually, I think the main thing in 2026 is this has not changed much despite all of the upheaval and the disruption in the news landscape. You still have nearly half of people saying they prefer news which doesn't have a particular point of view. And actually, the percentage of people who say they prefer news that shares their point of view has gone down over the last six years. So there's something enduring there in terms of what people believe in. But then we asked audiences what they actually think about 6 long-running news stories, and it was quite a simple question. Do you think the news media is doing a good or a bad job of covering these 6 stories here? And so if you think of this as a sort of net promoter score, you can see that with the exception of the Ukraine story, audiences in the UK are negative on each of the other 5 stories, with immigration really standing out as the story that audiences are least happy with in the UK context. This picture plays out a lot around Europe and in North America, where you can generally see similar relativities in terms of people's scores. Norway stands out as a market where people in general are much happier about the coverage of major stories, but there's one exception to that: immigration again. Cutting the data by people's self-declared political leaning also, I think, reveals some quite interesting detail here. So we have, for the UK, we have the overall view of all respondents in the middle. You can see that immigration is the story people are least happy about, both on the left and right of UK politics, but it's actually people on the left who are significantly less happy than anyone else about the way immigration is being covered. We wanted to ask about a different angle of public service media this year. So rather than asking people what they thought about public service output or public service organisations, we asked them about the social impact of news from public service media in their countries. So this was the question that you can see here across the 26 markets where we asked it. 37% of people were positive overall, and that's 15 percentage points ahead of those who said they were negative. But again, national variation in the results there. So in 18 of the 26 markets on the left, you can see there's a positive view. The UK is one of 3 markets where actually the view is mixed. It's balanced overall between those who are positive and negative about the social impact of public service news. And there were 5 markets which stand out as being ones where people actually thought that the social impact of news from public service media was negative. Again, political leaning plays a significant role in perspectives here, and this is both in markets where people are positive and negative overall. So in each country here you can see the data according to whether people are on the left, in the centre, on the right of politics. And if you take Australia as an example, where people overall are positive about the social impact of public service news, there's a big spread between those on the left and on the right. And you can see that play out in Europe in markets such as Germany, Spain, and the UK as well. That pattern doesn't hold everywhere. So in Slovakia, actually people on all parts of the political spectrum are unhappy about what's been happening to public service media and the social impact of it in recent years. And in Italy, it's people on the left rather than the right who are concerned about the social impact of public service news. It's really important to spend a bit of time talking about the commercial side of news. So reader revenue among the 20 markets where we have what we call a pay basket that we've been tracking for a number of years, not changed. This year remains at 17% overall. It's about 10% in the UK, but it's quite interesting if you dig beneath the data and look at different forms of reader revenue. You get different indicators about the complexion and the nuance of the market. So I'm showing here for each of these different forms of payment, the markets where the percentage is either the lowest or the highest. And you see in the UK, for example, that although paying for news is only 10% overall, 2/3 of people who are paying for news in the UK are doing so by way of a recurring payment, whether that's subscription or a membership and so on. So relatively small, but quite a healthy paying for news market in some senses, I think. We also wanted to ask people about why they pay for news, and this is the data from this year. I think one important, kind of almost obvious thing, but worth repeating, stands out, is like unique, distinctive content that people can't get anywhere else continues to be the foundation of successful reader revenue strategies. But people aren't necessarily doing this simply because of the direct personal benefits they get out of it. So nearly half the audience reflects some sense of kind of values-based or social motivation for supporting news publishers in what they're doing. Okay, let me finish up now just by recapping what some of the key points coming out of this year's research. I think that there are headlines here, but also reflections and things for people to take away and consider in a year that admittedly is quite tough in terms of the data, but I think that's just reflecting how tough the world is, that it was a spectacular news period in January and February when we were conducting the research, and there's no sense that things have slowed down since then. And overall you see anxiety on the part of audiences, but also an ongoing interest and belief in what news can do. The last thing I'm going to do, as Mitali trailed, is to show you this, which is our new fully rebuilt interactive site. The sheer volume of data in the report across the 48 markets is quite staggering as someone who's quite new to it. So we've rebuilt this to allow you to dig into the data within markets and to break it out by different demographic groups. You can also compare across markets to build your own charts, and for the first time we've also built into this the ability for you to download the data and conduct your own research across the base. So, as Mitali has also already said, I would also like to thank the team who've provided incredible support in my first year as author. I'd also like to thank the GOAT of the Digital News Report, Nick Newman, who's here. Nick has been just utterly selfless and generous in his time in kind of helping me play myself in. I really appreciate that, as well as the work of everyone in the team. There are many people involved. It is a huge undertaking, and I really appreciate how everyone has helped me out. But this research doesn't exist as an end in itself. It's a means to the strategic deliberations and the editorial discussions that are happening in publishers represented in this room. Everyone here, of course, believes that journalism really matters. The audience evidently thinks so as well, and I hope you find the data and analysis in this year's report useful as you continue your own reflections and discussions after today. Thank you.
We'll just take a second before our panel is here and seated, and I will take that time to say, Nick, I'm sorry, I think I missed your name at the start, and please put it down to nerves.
Okay, nice.
Okay. Do you want to go?
Okay, thanks.
Well, thank you for listening, engaging, and really reflecting on the data that Jim presented. What we're going to try and do now is just make sense of all of what the data is pointing to, and I have a fantastic panel to do that with me. Simon Robinson, Executive Editor at Reuters, Emily Kent-Smith, who is part of the Goalhanger team, and let me see if I'm saying this right, UK's largest independent podcast company. So I bet, right. Emily, you were sort of nodding your head through some parts of that data. Jim will be with us, of course, to unpack some of the details of the findings. And Kamal Ahmed, who is Executive Editorial Editor, I beg your pardon, at Fortune Europe and Middle East, which is a newish role, but an exciting one, as you told me, Kamal. Welcome to all of you. I know we're pacing for time, so I'm going to be a bit rat-a-tat-tat with the questions that I put to you. I think the first one, Simon, just to reflect on, is kind of the big one on platformization, which is a story of degrowth as much as it is a preference towards moving to these third-party platforms. And I think one of the key findings that we reflected on was the fact that some of this has been documented for TV, but we're seeing it move quite fast for websites, for news websites. From the pandemic to now, the fall is already about 12%. What's your own reflection on whether you think the industry sort of saw that shift coming this fast for news websites in specific?
I think in many ways they did, because I would differentiate between the platform and the content, because many large kind of traditional newsrooms produce content for the platforms. So people may be consuming their content, and whether it's video or anything else, off the main news platform that they're providing, but the content itself is still the BBC's, Reuters, whatever it is, the New York Times. That obviously has massive implications for revenue, because if you're not driving audience to your own platform, it's harder to make money, basically. But I think that the industry, to answer your question, the industry has seen this coming and kind of adapted. Is it perfect? By no means. And I think there's still a lot of thinking and work that needs to happen around how we cope with that big change.
Kamal, in some ways, Fortune is sort of spanning the entire gamut. It's got a physical magazine that still remains, and then you're diving into sort of individual summits, more person-to-person relations, and of course a presence on social media. How are you mapping what seems evident in these trends?
Well, first of all, thanks to Reuters, because this is one of the most important reports every year that I make sure that I read and my teams read. But as you say, Fortune, we have centres, Hong Kong, Singapore, London and New York. New York is our biggest centre. I think just a few things around the monetization point that Simon raises for us, which is really understanding our audience and knowing very precisely what it is that creates value for them. And I think we're thinking much more now as an organization, as you say, nearly 100 years old, started with a magazine alongside Time and Sports Illustrated. We were founded in the 1920s in America. And then the Fortune 500 index started in 1955. So that heritage really matters to our audience. Our audience are all about two things: business success and being ahead of the curve. So a really clear proposition to our audience. And then what we call full service provision. So what we call, in the business, earned media is only part of what we do. I sit across much more as a publisher for Fortune, for Europe and the Middle East, and that's across earned media. So that's the material you see on fortune.com and in the magazine, but also across partnerships, events, and very importantly, newsletters, which we see as a way of giving people, our communities, specific material that is for them. And that allows us to really differentiate our audience. And four sort of planks around value. So you've got human-made. Journalists are great at what they do because we meet lots of people, we talk to them, we distill, we're at lots of events that our audience would like to be at. I have to leave a bit early from here because I'm going to VivaTech, the biggest tech conference in Paris. Jeff Bezos will be there. Our audience will really want to know what's Jeff Bezos said after the SpaceX IPO about Blue Origin. He's talking about space on the platform on Wednesday. I will be in the room with him, and I want to then be able to use that value to create great content for our audiences. So human-made is the first thing, expertise the second thing, heritage, as I say. And then, I see Sophia is here as well, which is brilliant to see. Understanding how your audience wants to consume. So as you say, social media is a very important part of what we do, but it's only one channel to our audience. And as you say, Simon, it's very difficult to monetize. So we have nearly 1 million followers on Instagram. We're growing incredibly rapidly on third-party platforms. But actually, .com, events, newsletters, and the magazine with subscriptions is where real value is. And what we're finding is that events part, that human-to-human moment where we can invite our audience to particular conversations, to leverage the value of our journalism, is really where value is being created. So I feel very optimistic. Fortune, a very long Europe, very long Middle East. We are investing. So I feel very optimistic, but it's great to see the flags, the signals, both green, amber, and red from the Digital News Report.
So pivoting towards specialization, which is your USP, but also thinking about community, which I'm going to talk to Emily about. Simon, I do want to come back to you for one other key takeaway in this platformization conversation, which is the question that is often asked by the industry, of the industry: will the young people grow up and subscribe to a newspaper? Will they switch on the telly? And what we've seen this time round is a reverse drift, where this is not just about those young people, this is across age groups, where there is a preference to come to the news via third-party platforms, which immediately makes the connection both more incidental but also less trustful.
That's been the great hope, hasn't it? That if you build trust with an audience on TikTok or whatever it is, that people, when they get a job and they can afford to pay for a subscription, that they will. I think that in some cases they still will. I think that will happen, but I don't think it's going to happen in the way that we're used to historically. I don't think, I don't think that people who are consuming videos, say, on social are going to turn into that mass audience who watch the 7 p.m. news every night. I don't think that's going to happen. So I think that as an industry, we have to work out how to take those people and deliver for them in a way that works for revenue and works for the companies, but also continues to work for them.
Emily, you're checking off a lot of the boxes with, some of what both Simon and Kamal have said, which is sort of looking at more specialization in terms of the brands, the human brands that you build, which is looking at creating this very intimate journey with your audiences. There's merchandise, there's in-person events. Has the dial moved, do you think, from attention to intimacy?
Thanks so much, by the way, as well, for such a brilliant report. I found it fascinating to read, and as Kamal says, I think it's such an important reminder each year for our industry, so thank you. It's an interesting question, Mitali, because I think often when I was looking at that report, I was asking myself a lot of questions around news and journalism, and I suppose what is news and journalism now perhaps is almost another big question to be asked, i.e. people are getting information, they're being informed. You know, someone listening to hours of The Rest is History is an incredibly informed person, but they're perhaps not a news junkie, but they're still someone that's absorbing very important and interesting information. So I think there are questions to be asked there too. In terms of, I guess, the foundations of Goalhanger, Goalhanger started as a World War II podcast. So our founder effectively went to a bookshop, looked for a book about the Second World War for his dad, and thought there should be a podcast about this, I'm going to create one, which I think is just a really interesting founder story. And one of the things he often says is that if a commissioner were to look at that idea, they wouldn't commission it. So I think one of the great stories about Goalhanger is a lot of the ideas that Goalhanger pursued are quite offbeat. They're things that perhaps aren't being served well elsewhere, and that might perhaps explain the success of it. In terms of communities, I suppose all of our shows are almost individual kind of mini businesses and sort of empires. So The Rest is History is a very different business to The Rest is Science, to, for example, The Rest is Entertainment, and they have extremely different audiences. I noticed The Rest is Politics was obviously on the list, and they're the most newsy of the shows, but I suppose we cover an awful lot of bases. And the model is both a membership model, but also a free model as well. So if you're a member, we're having a festival in a couple of weeks, the first The Rest is History Festival, where you can spend 2 days listening to historians discuss history, which, you know, if you'd have said a couple of years ago, that'll be a hit event. I'm not sure many people will have believed you, but we're hoping that it will be a great success, and that's a members-only event. So the only way you're going to be able to come and hear those speakers is if you're a member. That's a good example of that. We also make T-shirts relating to many different periods in history. You can, I had a call recently with some of our Athelstan members, so they're like our top tier paying The Rest is History members, and one of them I thought summed it up brilliantly in a way that I couldn't have done, where they were like, they were American actually, the people I was speaking to on the call, and one of them said, the reason I love Tom and Dominic is because it feels like I'm having a pint with two great professors that otherwise I might not be able to talk to, and I thought that was a really nice way of summing it up.
Yeah, and I think you raised an important point, which is, and we'll come to creators in a bit, about sort of the parasocial element, which is this feeling of intimacy and interaction with the people presenting the news. In some ways, would you say for Goalhanger, the focus is sort of moved away from building a newsroom to just thinking about building these individual brands and then making a direct connection with the audiences and as an extension, does that come with some dangers of building individuals as brands?
I think that's a question we ask ourselves a lot, to be honest, and I don't know if we have fallen definitely on an answer. What is interesting is, on Kamal's point earlier, one of the reasons I joined Goalhanger was to set up our sort of written journalism strand and our newsletter strand, which is something we've launched in recent months. So that started with newsletters, so The Rest is Politics. We've been sort of really growing that at the moment, so it's a weekly newsletter plus weekend long reads from Rory and Alistair. And one of the things we've got a lot of insight in through that is that there is some audience crossover. So, for example, we've had Gordon Carrera from The Rest is Classified write for The Rest of Politics. We've asked people to sign up to that newsletter via the Politics newsletter, and we've seen quite a bit of success there. So I think there are definitely audience crossovers. And I think when you think about the type of content and where there could be audience crossovers, for example, the world of espionage and spying, you could see how that wouldn't be a world away from politics. But perhaps with other shows, there may be less direct connections. So I think the answer is we can probably do both things. So for example, when the Iran strikes happened, we sent round a mass email with respect from all of our hosts. So from Anthony Scaramucci to Alistair Campbell to Gordon Carrera, we had about 6 of our hosts basically give their takes. They're obviously experts in their very many different fields, and we saw success there. So I think there is opportunity for both, but I think ultimately Goalhanger is built around depth and intimacy and a desire for insights in very specialist areas. So I think we'd be nervous about diluting that.
Kamal, how do you think about some of the video-specific platforms as a brand? I think part of what's reflected is the maturity of YouTube, for example, as a platform where across age groups, about 1/3 are accessing it for news. TikTok is certainly sort of the social revelation of the last decade or so. It's completely changed how people are consuming videos, the duration of it, the style of it. What does that mean for a more legacy brand like yours?
I think because we have a very specific audience, which is C-suite business leadership and those that will be laddering up into business leadership. So an aspirational younger audience who are entrepreneurial, they want to hear from the latest disruptors, particularly in technology, for example. So our audiences actually do read a lot of the written work that Fortune is famous for, obviously initially through the magazine, but also now through .com and through our newsletters. So we get deep engagement via the written word. But it would be silly for us to ignore video and audio, and I think it's getting the right mix of that material. We have video podcasts, so vodcasts, we have a lot. So Alison Chantel, our editor-in-chief, does the Titans podcast, which is deep conversations with business leaders. We are looking at launching something similar in Europe and the Middle East. So we are looking at different ways of creating value for our audience. But just as Emily says, it's around expertise and how do you want it and when do you want it? And Fortune still is, there's a lot of sort of desktop engagement with us, you know, day to day, because our audiences are still quite PC based. They're not always on their phones, and they're not really scrolling for news on their phones. Their relationship with us is a deep relationship. We are not in the hamster wheel of 24 hours trying to churn out 300 stories a day. We're all about pausing, thinking about high value moments that you come to Fortune and you digest. And if you think about our competitors, which would be, you know, FT Weekend, The Economist, etc., those type of moments when you come to Fortune. So therefore, video is part of what we're doing, but it's not the same as a mass to retail brand, which has got a much broader audience, where the figures that, you know, Jim and you have been revealing today, video is absolutely essential. So it's a slightly quieter part of the mix, but still very important. It's how do we transfer the video grazing habits on your phone into long form conversation habits? Because we're all about conversation and long form and thematic. How do you make video work there? And you have to be quite thoughtful around that. We have an American division which works on vodcast, which we haven't yet transferred into Europe or into the Gulf, which is the next stage of I've got to think about how do we do that in a way, given what you said, Jim, about the flattening of news podcast growth, how do we do it in a way that's going to get more than, you know, 50 views a week, given what Goalhanger is doing in terms of really breaking the mold in long form conversation? We need to be thinking about what Emily is doing. How do we replicate that in Europe and the Middle East?
Simon, you're sat at a space where you can see a lot of different news organizations doing very different things. How are they thinking about video? Some of the feedback that's come to us is sort of the ROI on these videos is close to nothing. Some of the other frustrations is how do I build this sort of video muscle in my newsroom overnight, where there was 3 people editing and now we need sort of 20 videos a day.
I'm just going to go. Thank you so much, everybody. I've got to whiz off to catch a train to Paris, but it's been great. Thank you so much, Jim. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kamal. So I think it's particularly challenging, I think, for a newsroom like Reuters, which traditionally was a B2B operation, and we've only in the last few years moved into the consumer space. So building, in some ways, building kind of personality-led videos, not in any way to move away from the way we approach news according to the trust principles, which, you know, requires us to be independent, to be free from bias, to approach news from all angles. To do that and pull it off when there are a lot of you know, individuals kind of who are much more opinionated out in that space is quite difficult. In some ways it goes against the grain. I think we're doing a really good job of it. We're introducing shows. We've just, last Friday, we had introduced a pop-up World Cup video show once a week. That's a very kind of busy space at the moment. But I think that, we're kind of taking it one step at a time, but we really need to kind of get better at that kind of consumer space, because traditionally we've not been in it, and video is an area that we're moving into pretty quickly. I mean, I was thinking about, Kamal, Fortune was actually one of the first organizations, first newsrooms to really do events in a very big way. In the 1990s, they went into China and then India, and they would have these huge conferences called Fortune Forums, global forums. And it's interesting that, and I think this also relates to Goalhanger, I think that the days, in a way, of the mass kind of appeal, mass audience offerings in events and in other areas, it's harder to do that because of because you can get anything that you want and a much deeper version of it online now. Finding the kind of more niche audiences and really dividing the audiences one by one is becoming more important. So, you know, Fortune now, for the video stuff and even for events, I think they're much more focused in their audience thinking, and I think that's the same with you guys. That you know, you really deeply get to know your audiences. So for an organization like Reuters, where we cover the world and we do a lot, and we have 2,600 people around the world on the ground covering everything that is news on any given day. One of our big challenges, I think, is working out how to deliver that while keeping in mind that there are multiple different audiences and communities, which is an important word that Kamal used, not just one single big monolithic audience.
Emily, jump in on the point about video, because you are a podcast company, but there is quite a bit consumed in a video format. You do have young audiences who sort of connect up to a TV and watch some of your programs there. Anything that you're thinking about for the year ahead in terms of video specifically?
I think really the way we think as a brand is, we're sort of platform agnostic, i.e. we are on all platforms. So Spotify, Apple, we've obviously done a World Cup collaboration with Netflix that's running at the moment. YouTube is a big platform for us. And really so all of our shows are now, I think, what we describe as eyes optional. So i.e. you can watch them or you can listen to them, the choice is yours. They should be digestible in either format. Some of our shows now are bigger in video than they are in audio. You know, and you can understand the reason for that in some instances, i.e. if something's particularly, let's say a show like Science, where they use a lot of sort of props and things like that, there's an appeal of watching that rather than listening. But I think the way we think really is we need to be where our audiences are, and we need to be able to give them choice and not restrict them to one platform. So that's how we think, which is also why we're moving into writing as well, because we know that some people really like to read a newsletter in the morning, or they might want to spend Sunday with a coffee and read a long read. So really the way we look at it is we want to be everywhere, and we want to give people choice.
Simon, I'll ask you, and then of course Jim has done a lot of work on this as well. You raised the point of the Reuters trust principles, and we do have strong findings in terms of impartiality, the fact that audiences still prefer it for themselves and more broadly for society. There is a fundamental tension here, though, in terms of how they think about impartiality, where they access the news, which is on third-party platforms that tends to come with lower levels of trust. And for news organizations, it is clear that every platform comes with opportunity and risk, but it is also clear that sort of surfacing up your content in that space is increasingly challenging.
Yeah, I do. I think back, though, to the kind of the great anchors, especially in America, in the 50s and 60s, people on TV. I think one of the things that where there was very, very high trust was in particular people who delivered news in some ways in a very old-fashioned and straight kind of approach. And I think audiences, whether they were left, right, and you know, the world was not as polarized back then, but politically, but that they did a very good job of appealing to a wide audience and having that audience trust in them. So I think that in some ways there is an absolute tension between the way that creators kind of approach news, and obviously building in many cases off the back of mainstream news operations like Reuters or any other. You know, they're not in Iran. They're talking about Iran maybe, but they're showing video that appeared that Reuters shot, or they're showing, or they're talking about news that that Reuters first reported. Yeah. But they're doing it in a kind of, as we saw in the data, a more, I guess, entertaining way in a sense, or that's the perception, in a way that maybe speaks to the audience more directly, but that ultimately the audience also trusts it less. So there is that tension. I think for us, the challenge is to maintain our own journalistic standards, but to figure out clever ways of appealing to people where we're in some ways more relatable, more, I'm not sure I would say entertaining, but maybe entertaining even, but certainly more relatable and more kind of accessible. I think that's what audiences are looking for. If you can pull that off with the trust, then you're onto a winner, I think.
Jim, how does that square with our findings for audiences and PSMs? This is a year for the BBC where there will be a charter review. We looked at this question on how the public feels about kind of the social element of public sector broadcasters, public service broadcasters, and there is a range as you presented.
Yeah, and I think we were quite struck by the range, and some countries sit on that range. Again, to stress, we were asking people something very specific about the social impact of news of life on their country. So if you look here in the UK, for example, at news from public service media, from ITN and both the BBC, kind of both reach and trust are largely unchanged for those public service media here. But people are uncertain in the UK about the social impact. But I think looking at that data by people's political identity starts to allow you to kind of see what some of the reasons for that might be. And the fact that there's such polarization of views, both in markets such as France, for example, where people are negative overall, and markets like Australia, Norway, and Sweden, where people are positive. That's making life harder and harder for public service media, who they don't have the luxury or fortune or someone else to say, well, we're going to take a niche, double down on the news lovers in that segment. They have a mandate to serve everyone in their respective markets and countries, and doing that in a way that people appreciate and are more likely to say, yeah, we think that the role of this public service broadcaster has on life in our country is a positive one. That is extremely hard. You feel these polarizing forces starting to, risking, tearing countries apart.
Simon, some of that overwhelm is visible in the question that we asked about the big global stories and how the public feels the news media has covered it. Are you surprised by the findings that there is such a level of kind of thumbs down on some of the coverage?
So I haven't read all of the report yet. I am a little surprised, and I really want to dig into the reasons why. I think, I need to understand a little better why people, we saw again when you look at the left-right kind of political split, you begin to kind of suspect why certain groups are unhappy, and that's interesting. I was thinking as Jim was speaking that it would be, I don't know, is Hungary in the report?
Yep.
It would be super interesting to see in a year what's happened in Hungary, because there's been a big change in the government, and probably perceptions are will take a little while to see, but if the public broadcasters and the way the media operates is perceived to have changed, it will be interesting to see if there's a shift in Hungary, just as a bit of a kind of canary in the coal mine on questions like that. But I really now want to go away and figure out why people are unhappy with coverage of certain events, in particular on immigration.
I probably won't be let out the building if I don't say the word AI, so here I go, AI, which is something Reuters has been thinking about in a quite kind of aggressive and dynamic fashion over the last few years. How do you make that differentiation, though, Simon, based on the same concerns you raised about this sort of commoditization of information between what indeed is something that can be commoditized versus something that is a very unique experience, perhaps something that Emily and her colleagues are trying to build?
Yeah, I think that I think what you're going to see over the coming years, and first of all, just to back up and say, you know, Reuters, we benefit from the fact that we belong to a bigger company, Thomson Reuters, which is heavily invested in AI in all of its divisions, including its news division. And I think what you'll see over the coming years is in some ways a bit of a bifurcation between those areas of news which are predictable and scrapable and automatable, and we've done that for a couple of decades in terms of a lot of financial news. And I think that all of those parts of the news kind of world that can be where AI can be of huge help, and it can be, we should invest in that, and we should do that because it allows you then to present much more complex, narrative stories, more human-led news reporting and journalism. So I think that in some ways you're going to kind of see this two-track approach, and hopefully, our very broad strategy is to use AI to automate as much as is possible, so then you can reinvest in the other kind of more human-led stuff.
Emily, is that something you're thinking about as well, or is the focus right now very much on these, personality-driven interactions?
So I suppose one of Goalhanger's mottos is we're human-led, we're anti-brain rot. So at the heart of the company, we're not built around, I suppose, AI and something that can be automated. It's very much a personality-led and a sort of depth company. So at the moment, although obviously we're looking at AI in terms of from a processor's point of view and ways we could use it, there's no intention to use it in an audience-facing way. And I think touching on some of Simon's points earlier, a lot of what, and also some of the points Jim flagged earlier in the report, is a lot of what audiences are looking for right now, I think, is authenticity, depth, and things they can't find elsewhere. So I think where we have a real edge on that is, for example, the people that will watch our videos, they'll want to see Rory Stewart work out in real time how he feels about something. There's a sort of viral social media thing where it's like Rory Stewart's grimaces as he's thinking about something. That's not the kind of thing AI can replicate. AI can't replicate a discussion between Dominic Sandbrook and Tom Holland about the friendship between Samuel Johnson and James Boswell. So I think where we really want to double down on is just creating great content that isn't replicated by machines.
I want to go back to the point you made, Emily, about what is news, and that's sort of how you're thinking as well about the programs and the content that you offer up. And I know this tends to sort of get brushed under the carpet because the number increases every year, but the takeaway and the read in terms of news interest levels is, I think, really a grim reminder to all of us about how much work needs to be done. I mean, over the last decade in the UK as a market, for example, news interest has close to halved. That is a huge slice off. Do you think we need to be thinking differently about what is news? Or do you think we need to be thinking differently about the mediums of communicating the news?
I think sometimes news is just used as too broad a term, and I think even if we were asking someone, do you read the news, the answer might be no, but that doesn't mean they're not informed. That doesn't mean they're watching videos about the British economy. Doesn't mean they haven't read a newsletter that morning about investing. So would we still say that they're not people engaged in the news? So I do think we need to have a bit of a rethink about what news is versus what being informed is. I do think that they're different things.
I wonder if, say, all the employees at Goalhanger would be included in those industry-wide. I'm not sure if they're counted as journalists or not. I would argue they should be. So yeah, I agree on that point. Yeah.
And actually, an interesting point to make is we've started something new recently called Goalhanger Ventures, which is an investment arm, effectively. And one of the things we've invested in is a company called Invisible Hand. So this is one guy who started creating explainers, mainly that were kind of business and economics focused. And their largest audience are Gen Z. Now, that's not an audience to me that don't want to be informed. Also, we find that people spend actually a really long time with our products. It very much I suppose veers away from that stereotype of young people are a generation that swipe through things, don't have attention span. So I do think people want to spend time being informed. It's maybe just the broader term of news that people perhaps have an aversion to.
So not just venture capital, you have also been recently crowned the most successful and fastest growing brand across the UK, I think across businesses. I don't know if you read that in the Sunday Times, so there's lots of good news there. And Jim, final word with you on two counts. One, that there is an asymmetric tension here. News publishers are certainly not as large as several tech companies, but they are also larger than the individual. And I think that connection is something we have always tried to draw on in our report. And the second, that with the news, there are several principles being upheld around impartiality, around kind of freedom from bias, but perhaps a lack of engagement and interactivity versus social media, which is, has a much lower quality bar, but probably has much higher interaction, engagement. How does the news industry sort of try to square all of our findings with some of these inherent challenges? Your time starts now.
Small question.
So look, in many ways the report is a tough read. And when we were sitting in our little research room in Oxford seeing the data come in, it was really striking to see market after market where people are clearly anxious and are generally worried about the world, and not just what those big stories such as Donald Trump's second presidency mean for things at the macro level, but also what those news stories, what cost of living and inflation, what the immigration story means for them and their neighborhoods and where they live and so on. So I think we should be reminded that people are worried. They are alive to what's happening, and they need news organizations to help them make sense of it. I think on the declining news interest, the numbers are the numbers. You might argue that given the hyper-competitive environment people are instantly in when they're on social media and video networks, actually news is doing quite well, given the range of more instantly gratifying other options that people have and ways of spending their time. And I do think we're trying to be balanced on the role of creators, but I think creators deserve credit for the way that they have injected dynamism, new freshness and energy into and people are responding to that, and they are consuming content from news creators alongside existing brands. And my feeling is that the creator conversation might start to shift from who are creators to what are creators doing, and what can established news media do in terms of their story selection, format, storytelling, and so on, that emulates those things which are positive and dynamic and innovative.
And I think we're seeing some signs of that. And as Nick authored in the chapter this year, one of the important additions to news creators is the fact that in some countries, this is actually the only space for critical media,
right, exactly.
Where mainstream media has been quite strongly co-opted. I'm going to try and get a few questions in. Simple rules to raise your hand. We'll get a mic to you, and then you can pose your question. There's a lady here in the front. Maybe we can start here.
Thank you. A great report, great discussion. It's Jane Martinson here, and I just wanted to, I put my hand up quickly because I want to follow up on that. I was hoping to ask the other former BBC person, Jim, but I just taking that question, that I was really struck by, obviously the first time social networks have overtaken both the TV and news. What can the BBC do as a leader in Charter Review year with public service media? Trust has sort of stayed the same. Should we be arguing for some kind of social media led by the BBC? Can they take a role? Because it seems such a huge thing, particularly when it's the first time you asked a question about the social impact.
Right, well, it's not for me to tell the BBC what to do. And even when I was there, no one listened to me. It is it's clearly an extremely important year for the BBC and for the public media landscape overall. Some of the figures are definitely quite challenging about where audiences are, and I think in the UK context this is not so much about the BBC directly, but some of the respects and aspects in which the UK is an outlier. So I talked about very high concerns about fake news and misinformation, high levels of news avoidance and so on. Nevertheless, the BBC, both in reach and trust terms, continues to remain in the position that it is domestically. I mean, the other thing I would say is it is extremely striking where you see the BBC pop up in so many of the other 48 markets that we cover, both in terms of kind of like the league tables for reach and also perceptions of trust for the BBC. And, I said this when I was there, I would say it now in my position as someone, conducting research. There really are very few organisations like it anywhere, not just in the UK, but globally, and as inevitably everything gets caught up in, you know, the ongoing political heat and fury and so on, I think the people who are making the decisions about the BBC remit and charter and funding need to be very, very careful about what they currently have and what's at risk of being lost.
Simon, can I ask you to add to that? You're a Reuters veteran, of course, but you will be thinking about the role of PSBs a bit more deeply later in the year.
Yeah. So my news is that I'm leaving Reuters soon and going to run news and current affairs for the ABC in Australia. So it was interesting. I think, if I think back, I think it was 5 years ago when we had this release of the report, and we were all coming out of the first year of COVID, and trust actually was much higher.
Trust bump.
And there was a real trust bump. And so I was thinking, as I was listening to Jim, about how do you capture that for individuals in a more normal time, right? When COVID happened, it was a question of life and death. ABC in Australia is part of the information communications kind of network when there's a bushfire or when there's a flood, or and in those situations it's a question of life and death, and so engagement is very high, and also trust is quite high because, you know, the information matters. How do you take those moments, or the COVID period when on an individual basis people really needed factual information? I remember, I think my colleague Jane talking about it 5 years ago. How do you take that and kind of, I guess, build the idea or the perception or the awareness that actually news does have an impact on us individually, and so trusted news is something to be sought out and kind of, you know, I'm not going to talk at all about the BBC, especially in this year, but it's I think it's a big part of delivering trusted news to audiences which are becoming a little more skeptical.
Let's see if we can squeeze in one more question. Or not, we may have serviced you very well.
I think there's a hand.
There's a hand there. Sorry, I didn't spot you.
Hi there, Atif Rashid, the Analyst News. Thank you for the insightful report and discussion. I just want to ask about the panel's view on independent media. Where do you see the role, you know, with the rise of Zeteo and others starting their own media organizations, where do you see the role of independent media in the wider media landscape? Are they taking a chunk of the share of the established media platforms, or do you think they don't really pose a challenge right now to the established brands?
Emily, would you like to take that one?
Sure, yeah. One of the things I found really interesting about the report was the point around, I suppose, people at the moment turning to creators and podcasts and how that lives alongside a sort of news diet, I suppose. So maybe they're finding out what the news is on one platform and then they're coming to us for analysis afterwards. I think there is quite a big problem at the moment around perhaps one of the things I was thinking earlier when Simon was talking was this, I suppose, this sense of authenticity and what you know and what you don't know. And I think creators are very good at that. They're very good at being honest in real time around what the situation is. I think sometimes, and I worked at traditional media for a long time before this, there is perhaps, we always try and have the resolved questions there too quickly, perhaps, and perhaps there's something to be learned about that transparency, about what we don't know, as well as what we do know. And yeah, I think there is, I mean, you only have to look at the survey answers around things like immigration, you know, lots of other topics that people do feel let down currently. So I think that does leave a space for alternative media, of course.
I think we're at time, so we will wind down here. Only to say a big thank you to my panelists. Thank you to Jim and authors of the report. And I do want to pause for a second and say that I think the way we approach fundamentally the report is that it's a wind vane for the industry and an important reflection of what the most critical bond, which is with audiences, looks like. What we want to do over the next few weeks is hear from you. What resonated, what are the questions that come to your mind, what can we think about as we plan this ahead. But thank you for joining. To those online and those in the room, thank you to our partners and most importantly to all my colleagues at the Institute.